something about that. But somewhere in the back of my mind, I'm sure he also said something about my sodium levels. Now, probably some of you who've gone to a doctor recently probably had a similar talk about that you need to cut down on your salt intake because salt is, I guess, if you have too much of it, your arteries start to get a little too hard, you get hypertension. But Lord, I love salt. I can't imagine not having salt. What's on every dinner table and every restaurant table? Salt and pepper. How many of you even bother to put salt on it before you've even tasted the food? Some people do, because we're not convinced that it will be where we like it. And we certainly know when food doesn't have any salt in it at all, because it tastes like nothing. We also know real well when there is too much salt on something because we get almost the same reaction. Our palate goes, ugh. Salted mackerel immediately comes to my mind. That's one of those moments when I knew there was too much. I also can't imagine swimming in the ocean if there were no salt. Something wouldn't feel right. I'd be in a lake. But the thing about salt is that, yeah, we need sodium in our diet. There has to be some, because I don't know that much about biology, but I'm pretty certain I recall that you need it to function in some way. It probably was sweat. And if you don't sweat, you're going to have a different issue. So we know that we need a little bit, and we know when there's too much, and we know when there's not enough. But this thing that Jesus said that he told us salt is good, so I don't know what the American Medical Association would tell him. But I also know that part of him saying, what if salt lost its saltiness? That seems odd to me. I can't picture salt ever doing anything except staying in a cabinet for eternity and never losing its saltiness. I know some spices lose their stuff, but salt? I know sometimes they clump together, but ultimately I've never heard of such a thing. And of course, Jesus isn't really worried about table salt or the ocean. Jesus is in fact saying, there is aspects of you that are important, but if you lose them, how can you gain them back? There's a proper proportion in one's life that shows when you're leading your life correctly, everything's in balance. But when it's not, big problems. The last 2 weeks, the gospel, we've seen the disciples starting to lose some of their saltiness, if you will. Last week, you may recall, they were worried about who was the best. What a stupid argument. Who cares? As long as the work's getting done, I don't care who's the best. What matters is that things are getting done. And of course, they didn't want to admit to Jesus that this is what they were talking about. So, but this week, same problem. Different way of addressing it, though. John saying, we saw somebody casting out demons and he's not one of us. Doesn't have the right certificate. Doesn't attend the right church. Didn't go to the right college. And Jesus is like, again, you guys are missing the point. Who cares whether he's got all of that? What we do know is he's doing good for someone. And if he's doing it in my name, all the better. Because when you're doing the correct things in the name of Christ, Jesus is pleased. Isn't worried about all the little nuanced stuff. And sure doesn't want to hear his disciples arguing about pointless things. They're beginning to lose that proper balance. I have a feeling that there's when he says, have salt in yourself, there's that part of saying, know who you are. Know what you do well, and keep things in proportion. How many of you occasionally feel your life is out of balance? That there's too much of one thing, and it may be a good thing, but you know that there's just too much of it. But you'll also know there are places where something is really missing. Either it was something you were doing before that has been dropped, either got squeezed out of the schedule, fell out of the habit of it, and yet, because of its being missing, you are out of balance. Again, I think there's what Jesus is trying to point us to say, you can't lose sight of who you are. Cannot lose that saltiness, but you have to have it in perspective and in right relationship with all the other aspects of your life. I know when I lost track of exercising, things were really out of whack. Getting back into that routine, I'm not in perfect health yet, but I'm a lot better than I was. I also know that those times when I have lost track of the 10 minutes of just praying, that place where it's out of proportion again. The week doesn't go as well. Life doesn't feel as focused. When I give myself that 10 minutes, ooh, good things occur. Everything is in its right proportion. I also know that Jesus went a little overboard in telling people what to do when they had blockages. I don't see anybody in here who has intentionally maimed themselves, and yet I bet most of us would have something we know keeps us from being all that we could be, that if we could just eliminate it, we would. We also know that there are places that are not helping us in our relationship to God through Christ. Again, I don't think we're going to be plucking out our eyes anytime soon. I wouldn't advise it. Bad move. But do address the things that you know are not appropriate for your life, do not help you, and in fact, keep you from being and living out your full existence made in the image of God. When we have that, we don't have to worry about cutting our feet off, cutting our arms off, being thrown into hell. But we do need to worry about the balance. Worry about the way our lives are made out each day. To find the time to do the things that feed us, to keep us healthy spiritually, emotionally, physically, but most especially to get rid of those things that are in excess and are stopping us, that are maiming us in different ways. Ask yourself that question: where is in fact the salt not in balance in your own life? What are the places where a little pinch here would do great, and a little less here would do even better? Yet we know salt's important. Jesus used it as a metaphor. It's obviously been important for a long time, not a new discovery. Without salt, food doesn't taste as good. Our bodies don't work as well, and the ocean's not nearly as fun. With too much salt, it all tastes rotten. But in the end, we all need to have salt in ourselves. Understand what our strengths are, what our weaknesses are,